Number 1. Scott Peterson. She seemed like the perfect mother-to-be, and he was the doting husband. But behind closed doors in Modesto, California, their story would unravel into one of the most infamous cases of the early 2000s. By the end, America would be asking, who really was Scott Peterson? Scott Peterson grew up in San Diego, the youngest child in a blended family. Friends later described him as charming, easygoing, someone who could strike up conversation with anyone. After college, he pursued a career in the fertilizer business, settling with his wife, Laci, in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Modesto. To those around them, they looked like a picture-perfect couple. Laci was known for her warm personality and excitement about becoming a mother. She was 8 months pregnant with their first child, a boy they planned to name Connor. The Petersons' home was decorated for Christmas, and their future seemed bright. But appearances can be deceiving. On Christmas Eve, 2002, Scott told police he went fishing alone at the Berkeley Marina, more than 90 miles away, while Laci stayed home preparing for a family dinner. That night, Laci never showed up. When her family couldn't reach her, alarm bells began to ring. Imagine expecting a loved one to arrive for Christmas celebrations, only to realize they had vanished without a trace. The search for Laci was immediate and massive. Neighbors, friends, and strangers volunteered, plastering her photo across California. The story gripped the nation. But as the hours stretched into days, small cracks began to show in Scott's version of events. Investigators noted his unusual calmness. When interviewed on national television, his demeanor struck many as cold. While thousands of people searched for his wife and unborn son, Scott's behavior raised suspicions. And then came a shocking twist. Just weeks into the search, a woman named Amber Frey stepped forward. She revealed that she had been dating Scott Peterson, and that he told her he was single. Even more chilling, she said Scott told her he had lost his wife long before Laci ever disappeared. This revelation turned the case upside down. The grieving husband narrative collapsed, replaced by a portrait of a man living a double life. In April 2003, nearly 4 months after Laci vanished, a grim discovery was made. The remains of a woman and a late-term fetus washed ashore on the San Francisco Bay, near the very marina where Scott claimed he had been fishing. DNA testing confirmed the remains were Laci and Connor. The discovery left the community devastated and solidified the suspicions of investigators. Scott was arrested shortly after, found driving near the Mexican border with his hair dyed, car packed with cash, multiple cell phones, and camping gear. Prosecutors argued he was preparing to flee. Imagine seeing this unfold, the man once pleading for his wife's safe return, now caught seemingly running from justice. The trial began in 2004 and was watched closely across the country. The prosecution painted Scott as a selfish husband who wanted out of fatherhood and marriage, suggesting that his affair and financial troubles gave him motive. They highlighted inconsistencies in his alibi, his unusual calmness during the search, and Amber Frey's damning testimony. The defense, meanwhile, insisted there was no physical evidence tying Scott to Laci's death, arguing that investigators built their case on circumstantial clues and public outrage. Despite those arguments, the jury deliberated for less than a week before reaching a verdict. In November 2004, Scott Peterson was convicted of killing his wife, Laci, and their unborn son. A month later, he was sentenced to death. At the time, many believed the case was closed forever, but legal battles would stretch on for nearly 2 decades. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence, citing errors in jury selection. Though the conviction itself stood, Scott was resentenced in 2021 to life imprisonment without parole. Then, in 2022, he sought a new trial, claiming juror misconduct. That attempt failed, leaving his conviction firmly in place. Today, Scott Peterson remains behind bars at Mule Creek State Prison. He is not eligible for parole and continues to maintain his innocence, though appeals have been exhausted. For Laci's family, the years of courtroom battles have kept wounds from fully healing. The public fallout was enormous. The case dominated news cycles, talk shows, and true crime specials. Laci's disappearance became a symbol of fear for suburban families, sparking debates about media sensationalism and the death penalty. Modesto, once just another Central Valley town, became a household name. Many Americans still remember exactly where they were when the verdict was announced. Reflecting on the story, one question lingers. Was Scott Peterson truly the man he appeared to be? The charming husband, the expectant father? Or was that image always a facade? The case reminds us how fragile trust can be and how quickly a picture-perfect life can shatter. Even now, more than 20 years later, the name Scott Peterson carries with it a chilling lesson about appearances, betrayal, and justice. Number 2. Chris Watts. They looked like the model American family. Smiling parents, 2 playful little girls, and a 3rd child on the way. On social media, Shanann Watts often posted videos showing a happy, thriving home. But in August 2018, that image shattered. Behind the smiles, something darker had been building, and when the truth came out, it horrified the world. Chris Watts lived with his wife Shanann in Frederick, Colorado. He worked as an operator for an oil company, quiet and seemingly devoted. Shanann, by contrast, was outgoing, warm, and active online. She often shared her family life on Facebook, where friends followed her posts about marriage, motherhood, and her excitement for the baby boy she was expecting. They already had 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste, and by all appearances, they were a loving family of 4, soon to be 5, but appearances can be misleading. By the summer of 2018, Shanann confided to friends that something felt wrong. Chris had grown distant, detached, almost like a stranger. What she didn't know at first was that Chris had begun an affair with a coworker, and his life at home no longer seemed to match the life he wanted. Imagine sensing that the partner you built everything with is slipping away while you're carrying their child. On August 13th, 2018, Shanann returned from a business trip to Arizona. A friend dropped her off at home around 2 a.m. Later that morning, she missed a doctor's appointment and failed to answer calls. That same friend, worried and persistent, went to the house. The front door was locked, Shanann's car sat in the garage, and her purse and phone were still inside. Something was terribly wrong. Police were called, and the search began. At first, Chris seemed like the worried husband. He gave interviews, asking for Shanann and the girls to come home. He stood on his front porch, cameras rolling, as he pleaded for their safe return. But as investigators looked closer, cracks in his story appeared. Security footage from a neighbor's camera showed Chris backing his truck into the garage early that morning, unusual considering his routine. His demeanor struck detectives as odd, too calm, too flat, as though he were reciting lines. The turning point came when Chris agreed to take a polygraph test. Investigators sat him down, assuring him that honesty would help. But when the results came back, it was clear he hadn't been truthful. Faced with mounting evidence, Chris finally confessed, but only partially. He first claimed that after he told Shanann he wanted to separate, she harmed their daughters, and he retaliated. Investigators pressed harder, pointing out inconsistencies. And soon the fuller, tragic truth emerged. Chris admitted to ending Shanann's life in their home, then taking her and the children to one of his company's oil sites. There, he placed his daughters' bodies into storage tanks and buried Shanann nearby. The details shocked the nation, not only for the brutality, but for the betrayal. This was not a stranger breaking into a home. This was a father and husband turning on his own family. The legal process moved swiftly. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to 9 counts, including killing Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn son they had planned to name Nico. The plea spared him from the death penalty, but it ensured he would never walk free again. Just 2 weeks later, on November 19th, the court sentenced him to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 84 years for other charges. The judge called the crimes the most inhumane and vicious he had seen. Today, Chris Watts is serving his sentence in Wisconsin, transferred from Colorado for his own safety. Reports suggest he spends most of his time in isolation, a far cry from the life he once projected online. Shanann's family, meanwhile, has dedicated themselves to preserving her memory and raising awareness about family violence. The public fallout was immediate and intense. Media outlets broadcast the story worldwide. True crime programs dissected every detail, while social media overflowed with outrage and grief. Shanann's online videos, once symbols of family joy, became haunting reminders of lives cut short. The case forced painful questions. How well can we ever know someone, even the person we marry? How do neighbors, friends, and coworkers miss the warning signs until it's too late? In the years since, the Watts case has continued to resonate, not because of complicated forensics or unsolved mysteries, but because of the chilling simplicity. A seemingly ordinary husband, living in a quiet Colorado subdivision, made choices that destroyed an entire family. Imagine walking past that house, once filled with laughter, now standing as a monument to betrayal. Reflecting on it all, one thought lingers. The smiling photos, the cheerful posts, the image of perfection, none of it could hide the truth forever. And when the truth came out, it reminded us that even the most ordinary lives can conceal extraordinary darkness. Number 3, Drew Peterson. He was a decorated police sergeant, the kind of man who took an oath to protect others. But by the time the spotlight turned on Drew Peterson, the question was no longer about his service. It was about how many women close to him had met mysterious and tragic ends. Drew Peterson lived in Bolingbrook, Illinois, a suburb outside of Chicago. As a longtime police officer, he carried himself with authority and confidence. To neighbors, he seemed like the man who had everything: a stable career, a nice home, and a growing family. His personal life, however, was complicated. Drew had been married 4 times. His 4th wife, Stacy Peterson, was young, vibrant, and just 23 when she disappeared in 2007. But long before that, questions had already been swirling about his 3rd wife, Kathleen Savio. Kathleen and Drew had gone through a bitter divorce. In 2004, Kathleen was found dead in her bathtub. At the time, her death was ruled an accidental drowning. Drew moved on quickly, marrying Stacy, who became stepmother to his children. On the surface, it looked like Drew had simply started over. But Kathleen's friends insisted something was off. They remembered her fears, the things she had confided about Drew, and they doubted the official story. Still, for years, nothing changed. Kathleen's death remained closed, a tragic accident. Then came October 2007. Stacy, just 23, and the mother of 2 young children, vanished without a trace. Drew told police that she had simply left him, possibly with another man, and abandoned her children. But Stacy's family and friends refused to believe that. She adored her kids and was deeply rooted in her community. The idea that she would disappear voluntarily seemed impossible. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing your sister, your daughter, your friend has vanished. And the only explanation is from the husband who insists she ran away. The disappearance of Stacy Peterson ignited a media firestorm. Cameras swarmed Bolingbrook. Drew, instead of hiding, leaned into the attention. He gave interviews, sometimes joking, sometimes defensive, always insisting on his innocence. But with every word, suspicion grew. The missing young mother became headline news, and with it came renewed scrutiny of Kathleen Savio's earlier death. Authorities decided to take another look. Investigators exhumed Kathleen's body in 2007, 3 years after her burial. This time, forensic experts concluded what many had long suspected. Kathleen had not drowned accidentally. She had been the victim of a homicide. That ruling opened the door to a new case, one that pointed directly to Drew Peterson. The trial began in 2012. Prosecutors argued that Drew had staged Kathleen's death to look like an accident, but the evidence told a different story. Witnesses testified about Kathleen's fear of Drew and about his controlling behavior. Friends and family recounted chilling conversations. Even Stacy's voice was present in the courtroom through testimony about things she had confided before she vanished. Though Stacy herself remained missing, her disappearance cast a long shadow over the proceedings. The defense pushed back, arguing the case was built on speculation and hearsay. They tried to portray Drew as a flawed but innocent man, targeted because of media attention and public pressure. But the jury wasn't convinced. After weeks of testimony, they found Drew Peterson guilty of killing Kathleen Savio. In September 2012, he was sentenced to 38 years in prison. At his sentencing, Kathleen's family expressed relief but also heartbreak. Justice had come, but only after years of doubt and delay. Drew himself continued to insist on his innocence, showing little remorse. The legal battles didn't end there. Appeals followed, but in 2017 the Illinois Supreme Court upheld the conviction, cementing Drew Peterson's fate. He remained behind bars, serving his sentence. In a strange twist, he later faced additional charges after allegedly plotting to harm a prosecutor involved in his case. That plot earned him more prison time, only deepening his downfall. Meanwhile, Stacy Peterson's case remains unresolved. Her body has never been found, and Drew has never been charged in her disappearance. For Stacy's family, the pain endures. Each anniversary brings renewed calls for answers, and her children have grown up without their mother. The public fallout was enormous. The Drew Peterson saga became a staple of true crime television and documentaries. The image of a police officer, someone sworn to uphold the law, now convicted of killing his wife, shook communities across the country. It fueled conversations about domestic abuse, power dynamics, and how authority figures can sometimes hide behind their badges. Reflecting on the story, one haunting truth remains. Kathleen's death was nearly written off forever as an accident, and Stacy's fate is still unknown. If not for Stacy's disappearance, Kathleen's case might never have been reopened, and justice might never have been served. The case forces us to ask, how many stories remain hidden, dismissed, or misread until another tragedy forces the truth into the light? Number 4. Michael Peterson. On a quiet December night in 2001, a frantic 911 call came from a Durham, North Carolina mansion. Michael Peterson, a novelist and former newspaper columnist, told operators that his wife had fallen down the stairs. But by the time first responders arrived, the scene raised far more questions than answers. And it would launch one of the most debated true crime cases in recent memory. Michael Peterson lived an accomplished life. He was a Vietnam veteran, a successful writer, and a familiar figure in the community. He lived in a sprawling home with his wife, Kathleen Peterson, a respected executive at a telecommunications company. Friends described them as a well-matched couple, intelligent, ambitious, and socially active. Their blended family included children from both of their previous relationships, and, by all accounts, their lives seemed stable and comfortable. But everything changed on the night of December 9th, 2001. Around 2:40 a.m., Michael dialed 911. He reported that Kathleen had fallen down a staircase and was barely breathing. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but Kathleen was pronounced dead. Michael insisted it was a tragic accident. She had been drinking wine, possibly taken Valium, and must have slipped. Imagine being in his shoes, trying to convince investigators that a fall explained everything, while the scene itself suggested otherwise. The staircase told a different story. Kathleen was found at the bottom, surrounded by a shocking amount of blood. There were lacerations on her head, but no skull fractures. To some investigators, the injuries didn't look like the result of a simple fall. Within days, suspicion turned toward Michael. Detectives argued that the blood spatter patterns, the multiple wounds, and the inconsistencies in his account pointed to violence rather than accident. As the investigation deepened, prosecutors uncovered details that complicated the picture. They revealed Michael had been communicating with men online, suggesting a secret life that Kathleen may not have known about. They painted a picture of marital strain, hinting at financial troubles as well. The discovery of Michael's bisexuality became a centerpiece of the prosecution's theory. They argued Kathleen had discovered his secret, leading to a violent confrontation on the stairs. But perhaps the most startling twist came from halfway across the world. Investigators learned that years earlier, in Germany, Michael had been living with another woman, Elizabeth Ratliff. She, too, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in 1985. At the time, her death was ruled a brain hemorrhage, but once Kathleen died under eerily similar circumstances, authorities exhumed Elizabeth's body. A medical examiner later suggested her death was consistent with homicide. That revelation, whether coincidence or connection, was devastating for Michael's defense. The trial began in 2003 and quickly became a media spectacle. The prosecution relied heavily on expert testimony, especially from a blood spatter analyst who insisted the evidence pointed to a beating rather than a fall. They presented Michael as a man living a double life, capable of deception and violence. The defense countered with their own experts, who argued Kathleen's injuries were consistent with a fall, and that the state had stretched the evidence to fit a theory. They reminded the jury that no murder weapon was ever found. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury sided with the state. In October 2003, Michael Peterson was convicted of killing Kathleen and sentenced to life without parole. For many, it seemed like the case was settled, but the story was far from over. Years later, new revelations cast doubt on the trial itself. The blood spatter expert whose testimony had been crucial to the conviction was found to have given flawed evidence in multiple cases. In 2011, a judge ruled that Michael deserved a new trial due to the discredited testimony. After nearly a decade behind bars, Michael was granted release on bond while awaiting a retrial. The retrial never happened. In 2017, Michael entered what's called an Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter. That meant he did not admit guilt, but acknowledged the state had enough evidence to convict him. With time served, he walked free. By then, he had already spent 8 years in prison. The case became widely known through the documentary series The Staircase, which followed Michael's trial and appeals for over a decade. The series gave viewers unprecedented access, showing the inner workings of the defense team, Michael's own interviews, and the emotional toll on everyone involved. It turned a courtroom battle into a cultural debate. Was Kathleen's death a tragic accident, a violent crime, or something stranger still? One theory even emerged that Kathleen may have been attacked by an owl, a possibility raised due to feather traces and unusual wound patterns. While it sounds far-fetched, it added yet another layer of intrigue to a case already brimming with questions. Today, Michael Peterson lives quietly, no longer the public figure he once was. The Peterson family remains divided. Some children continue to support him, while others believe he is guilty. Kathleen's loved ones, meanwhile, still carry the pain of unanswered questions. The public fallout was enormous. The case highlighted flaws in forensic science, raised questions about bias in trials, and sparked debates about how much of private life should factor into guilt. The Staircase transformed the case into one of the most famous in modern true crime, ensuring that even decades later, people continue to argue over what really happened that night. Reflecting on it all, the haunting question remains: did Kathleen Peterson stumble on her own, or was she pushed into eternity at the bottom of those stairs? The truth may never be fully known, but the case reminds us how a single night can fracture families, ignite decades of debate, and leave a mystery echoing long after the courtroom doors close. Number 5. Mark Sievers. She was a well-loved doctor in her community, dedicated to her patients, and known for her warm, caring presence. But when Teresa Sievers returned home from a family trip in June 2015, she walked into a nightmare. By the next morning, her husband, Mark Sievers, was on the phone reporting her death. What looked at first like a brutal home invasion soon unraveled into something far darker, a murder planned within her own household. Teresa Sievers was a holistic physician in Bonita Springs, Florida. She was outspoken, energetic, and passionate about her work. Patients trusted her not only for her medical knowledge, but also for her compassion. Outside the clinic, Teresa was a mother of 2 and known among friends for her vibrant personality. Her husband, Mark Sievers, managed her practice and seemed like the quiet partner, someone content to stay in her shadow while running the business side of things. Together, they looked like a successful couple, balancing career and family life. But beneath the surface, tensions were brewing. Teresa's career was thriving, while Mark struggled with insecurity and fears about their marriage. Friends later testified that Teresa had confided about marital problems and the possibility of separation. To Mark, the prospect of losing her and the stability of their life was something he couldn't accept. Imagine building your identity around someone else's success, only to feel it slipping through your fingers. On June 28, 2015, Teresa returned home alone from a family trip to Connecticut. Mark and the children stayed behind for another day. That evening, neighbors noticed nothing unusual. But the next morning, Teresa's mother, concerned when she didn't show up for work, went to check on her. What she found was horrifying. Teresa had been killed inside her home. The scene was violent and shocking. Detectives quickly realized this wasn't a random break-in. Investigators combed through phone records, surveillance footage, and financial documents. Soon, a chilling trail emerged. Mark Sievers had reached out to his longtime friend, Curtis Wright, just before the murder. Wright, who bore an uncanny physical resemblance to Mark, had a troubled past, including criminal records. He and another man, Jimmy Rogers, traveled from Missouri to Florida the very weekend Teresa returned home. Prosecutors later said they were waiting when Teresa walked in, and she never made it past her own kitchen. The turning point in the case came when Curtis Wright struck a deal with prosecutors. He admitted his role in the killing and revealed that Mark Sievers was the mastermind. According to Wright, Mark feared losing his marriage, custody of his daughters, and financial security, so he orchestrated the plan to have his wife eliminated, offering payment and providing access to the house. Imagine hearing that, a husband willing to plot against his own wife, using a friend as the executioner. The trial began in late 2019. The prosecution laid out the evidence: phone calls, suspicious travel, Wright's testimony, and the unraveling of Mark's motives. They described him as cold, controlling, and desperate to maintain control of his life at any cost. The defense countered by attacking Wright's credibility, insisting that the state's star witness was a liar seeking to save himself. They argued that the case was built on the words of a criminal, not hard physical evidence linking Mark to the crime scene. But the jury saw enough. In December 2019, Mark Sievers was found guilty of orchestrating Teresa's killing. The verdict left Teresa's family in tears, both for the loss of their loved one and for the betrayal at the heart of it all. Then came the sentencing. In January 2020, the court imposed the harshest penalty available: death. The judge described Mark's actions as cold-blooded and calculated. He would sit on Florida's death row while his daughters grew up without their mother and without the father they once trusted. Appeals followed, as they often do in capital cases. But in 2022, the Florida Supreme Court affirmed both his conviction and his death sentence, leaving little doubt about his fate. Curtis Wright, in exchange for his testimony, received 25 years. Jimmy Rogers was sentenced to life in prison. Each man played his role, but it was Mark Sievers who had set the plan in motion. The public reaction was visceral. The case captured headlines across the country, not just for its brutality, but because of who Teresa was. A doctor devoted to healing had been destroyed by the person closest to her. Community members left flowers outside her office, mourning not only the loss of their physician, but also the unraveling of a family they thought they knew. Reflecting on the case, the question remains, how does love turn into something so destructive? Was it fear, jealousy, or control that drove Mark Sievers to make choices that ended his wife's life and destroyed his daughter's future? The story reminds us that sometimes danger isn't lurking outside the home. It's already sitting across the table. Number 6. Neil Entwistle. At first glance, they seemed like any young couple starting out their lives together in the suburbs of Massachusetts. Neil Entwistle, a British national, had moved to the U.S. with his wife, Rachel, and their baby daughter, Lillian. They had dreams of a bright future ahead. But in January 2006, what should have been the beginning of their new life turned into a horrific crime that shattered the tranquility of their home and ignited a whirlwind of suspicion and heartbreak. Neil and Rachel Entwistle met while Rachel was living in England, where Neil had grown up. They married and soon had a daughter, Lillian, who was born in April 2005. The young family settled in a quiet neighborhood in Hopkinton, Massachusetts, where Rachel's family lived nearby. Rachel had a steady job as a sales manager, and Neil had found work, though his career prospects were less clear. Despite the outward appearance of a typical suburban family, there were cracks forming beneath the surface. Neil's life in the U.S. was not what he had hoped for. Struggling with financial problems and an unclear career path, Neil's situation grew more precarious. Rachel, on the other hand, had recently expressed dissatisfaction with their relationship and had begun to seek professional help to address their marital issues. Friends described her as a loving mother who was dedicated to her daughter and determined to make her marriage work. But by early 2006, her patience was wearing thin. On January 21, 2006, Rachel and Lillian were found dead in their home. The scene was gruesome. Both mother and child had been shot in the head at close range. Rachel was found in the master bedroom, and Lillian was lying next to her in her crib. Neil was nowhere to be found. Initially, police suspected a home invasion, but everything changed when Neil turned up in his hometown of Nottingham, England, just days later. Neil told police that he had gone to visit his parents after the deaths of his wife and daughter, but his story seemed inconsistent with the evidence. He quickly became a prime suspect. As investigators pieced together the details of his movements, they discovered that Neil had made a series of phone calls from his hotel room, seemingly coordinating his story and talking to people who could vouch for his alibi. His attempt to cover his tracks only raised more questions. The investigation revealed startling information about Neil's financial difficulties, which he had kept hidden from Rachel. It also came to light that he had recently made a large cash withdrawal just before the murders. The most damning evidence, however, came from his own actions. Neil had purchased a gun just weeks before the killings, despite having no apparent need for it. Furthermore, authorities discovered that he had arranged a trip to England just before the murders took place, a trip he had conveniently already planned before the deaths occurred. A few days after returning to the UK, Neil was arrested in connection with the killings. By this time, police had uncovered a clear pattern of deceit. The evidence suggested that Neil had planned the murders meticulously, hoping to escape his financial troubles by killing his wife and daughter, and staging the scene to look like a botched robbery. His actions, however, were too disorganized and careless to convince anyone that he was innocent. The trial began in April 2008. The prosecution argued that Neil had murdered Rachel and Lillian in a calculated attempt to free himself from his mounting financial and marital problems. They presented evidence of his financial woes, his obsession with escaping his responsibilities, and his lies about his whereabouts. The defense, on the other hand, claimed that there was no direct evidence linking Neil to the murders. They argued that the case was based on circumstantial evidence and speculation. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just a few hours before returning a guilty verdict. Neil Entwistle was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for Rachel and one for Lillian. The jury found that the murders were premeditated, and they rejected the defense's argument that the killings were unintentional or the result of some external factor. In June 2008, Neil was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His appeal in 2012 was rejected by the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, which upheld his conviction. The case was a devastating blow to Rachel's family, who had lost not only a beloved daughter and granddaughter, but also the person they had trusted to take care of Rachel and Lillian. The public fallout from the case was profound. The brutal nature of the crime shocked the small community, and the case was covered extensively in the media. The story of a man willing to murder his wife and daughter to escape his problems left many reeling. For those who knew the family, it was hard to reconcile the image of a young couple with a baby, seemingly full of promise, with the cold, calculated murderer who had been hiding in plain sight. Reflecting on the case, one question remains. What drove Neil Entwistle to commit such an unthinkable act? Was it financial desperation, a lack of accountability, or something more deeply rooted in his psyche? The case is a tragic reminder of how fragile life can be, and how even those closest to us can harbor dark, hidden secrets. It also raises difficult questions about how well we can ever really know the people we love and trust. Number 7. Christian Longo. At first, Christian Longo appeared to have the perfect life. He was a charming man, an aspiring entrepreneur with a wife, MaryJane, and 3 beautiful children. They lived in a picturesque home in Oregon, and from the outside, they seemed like the embodiment of the American dream. But in December 2001, everything changed. Christian's seemingly perfect life would come to a tragic and horrifying end, leaving a community and a family torn apart. Christian Longo and his wife MaryJane were high school sweethearts. They had 3 children, Zachary, 4, Sadie, 3, and Madison, 2. And for a time, they lived an idyllic suburban life. Christian worked various jobs and even dreamed of starting his own business. MaryJane was a loving mother, dedicated to raising their children and keeping their family together. From the outside, they were an all-American family, young, ambitious, and full of potential. But things weren't as they seemed. Christian had a dark side that he kept hidden from the world. He was struggling financially, living beyond his means, and his marriage to MaryJane had begun to deteriorate. As debts mounted and stress mounted, Christian's actions became more erratic. He began to drink heavily and lie to those closest to him. His relationships with his wife and children started to break down, and it became increasingly clear that Christian was spiraling. On December 19, 2001, the unthinkable happened. MaryJane Longo and her 3 children were reported missing. Christian told friends and family that they had gone to visit relatives in Michigan, but no one could reach them. He was reportedly calm and collected, but as time passed, his behavior raised suspicions. On Christmas Eve, Christian was arrested in Mexico, attempting to flee the country. He had abandoned his family and left for the border, thinking he could escape the consequences of his actions. The truth, however, was far darker. The investigation that followed uncovered a chilling story. Christian had killed his wife, MaryJane, and their 3 children. He had brutally bludgeoned them to death, leaving their bodies hidden in remote locations. His plan was to stage the disappearance, hoping the police would believe that his family had left on their own. But the truth came to light when the bodies of his wife and children were found, their lives taken by a man who had once promised to protect and love them. The trial began in 2003, and the evidence against Christian was overwhelming. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had grown increasingly violent and desperate, willing to murder his own family to escape his mounting troubles. They argued that the murders were premeditated and that Christian had planned the killings for months before finally acting. They also pointed to his behavior after the murders, which included fleeing the country and lying to authorities. Christian's defense tried to argue that the murders were a result of mental illness, but the jury wasn't convinced. In March 2003, Christian Longo was convicted of the murders of his wife and 3 children. The jury sentenced him to death. For MaryJane's family, the verdict was bittersweet. They had lost their loved ones in the most horrific way imaginable, and now Christian would pay the ultimate price for his crimes. But the case didn't end there. In 2022, after more than 2 decades on death row, Oregon's governor commuted all death sentences to life without the possibility of parole, including Christian Longo's. The decision was met with mixed reactions. Some believed that justice had finally been served, while others felt that Christian should have faced the death penalty for his horrific crimes. Christian Longo now serves his sentence at the Oregon State Penitentiary, where he will remain for the rest of his life. Over the years, he has maintained his innocence in the killings, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. For MaryJane's family, the pain of their loss continues to this day. The public fallout from the case was intense. The story of a father who murdered his wife and children to escape his financial and emotional problems shocked the nation. Christian's actions raised questions about the nature of evil and the lengths to which someone could go to escape responsibility. It also sparked a larger conversation about mental illness, domestic violence, and the failure of society to identify the warning signs before it's too late. Reflecting on the case, one question continues to haunt. What was it that drove Christian Longo to take the lives of the people he had sworn to love and protect? Was it a desire to escape his mounting debts, a moment of madness, or something deeper within him? The case reminds us that the line between normalcy and tragedy is thinner than we often realize. Even the most ordinary seeming lives can hide unimaginable darkness. And sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones capable of the most unspeakable acts. Number 8. Jeffrey MacDonald. It was supposed to be a night like any other, a quiet evening in a suburban home with a family preparing for the future. But on February 17, 1970, that peace was shattered in a brutal crime that would remain one of the most controversial in American history. Jeffrey MacDonald, an army doctor, was found at the scene of the crime, but his story would raise more questions than answers. Did a devoted husband and father really commit murder, or was he the victim of a twisted set of circumstances beyond his control? Jeffrey MacDonald was a highly educated and well-regarded man. He served as a captain in the U.S. Army, and by all accounts, he had a bright future ahead of him. His wife, Colette, was a beautiful and intelligent woman, and together they had 2 young daughters, Kimberly and Kristen. The family lived on the Fort Bragg military base in North Carolina, where Jeffrey worked as a doctor. To those around them, they seemed like the picture of success, a young couple with a promising future, a growing family, and all the outward trappings of a happy life. But that idyllic life would come crashing down in the early morning hours of February 17, 1970. When the police arrived at the MacDonald home, they found a scene of horror. Colette and the 2 girls had been brutally murdered. Colette was pregnant at the time, and her injuries were particularly gruesome. The young girls had been stabbed multiple times. Jeffrey MacDonald, the only survivor, was found with minor injuries and an unusual story. He claimed that he had been attacked by a group of intruders, 3 men and a woman, all dressed in military fatigues and chanting bizarre phrases. MacDonald told the police that he had tried to fight them off, but in the end, he was the only one left alive. At first, investigators were inclined to believe his story, but as they began to examine the evidence, doubts quickly arose. There were inconsistencies in MacDonald's account, and some of the physical evidence didn't seem to match his story. For example, MacDonald had injuries that seemed inconsistent with the brutal struggle he described. Furthermore, a bloody fingerprint found on the scene didn't match any of the intruders he described, but it did match MacDonald's own. As the investigation unfolded, the theory of a violent break-in began to unravel. In the years following the murders, the case became a highly contentious one. Jeffrey MacDonald was charged with the murders of his wife and children, and in 1979, he was convicted of all 3 murders. The prosecution argued that MacDonald had killed his family in a fit of rage, possibly due to marital problems and his desire to avoid the responsibility of being a father. His defense team insisted that he was innocent and that the evidence was inconclusive. Despite his conviction, MacDonald continued to maintain his innocence. Over the years, he filed numerous appeals, claiming that the case against him was based on flawed evidence, and he sought to have his conviction overturned. His case gained attention from the public, many of whom believed he was wrongfully convicted. Books, documentaries, and television programs examined the case, drawing attention to the many inconsistencies in the investigation and the trial. However, despite these efforts, MacDonald's conviction was upheld. In 2021, he filed a request for compassionate release due to his declining health, but the court rejected his appeal, reaffirming his life sentence. Jeffrey MacDonald remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence at a federal facility. The case left a deep and lasting impact on the American public. The trial was highly publicized, and many debates arose over the fairness of the investigation and the conviction. Some believe that MacDonald was wrongfully convicted, citing the many questions surrounding the case. Others believe that MacDonald was guilty and that his appeals were a desperate attempt to avoid responsibility for his actions. The case became a symbol of the challenges that arise when there are serious doubts about a conviction. For Colette MacDonald's family, the pain of losing their loved ones remains fresh, and the question of what really happened that night continues to haunt them. Despite the controversies surrounding the case, one thing is certain: 3 innocent lives were lost, and the tragedy still casts a long shadow. Reflecting on the case, one thing remains clear. The line between truth and fiction can often become blurred in criminal investigations. In the end, the question of whether Jeffrey MacDonald truly committed the murders or was the victim of a bizarre and tragic series of events remains unanswered. But for the MacDonald family and for the public, the case remains a chilling reminder of how easily truth can be distorted, and how even the most educated, respected individuals can become caught in a web of suspicion, doubt, and tragedy. Number 9. John List. He was a man who seemed to have it all: a well-paying job, a beautiful wife, and 3 healthy children. But on November 9, 1971, John List made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. In a quiet suburban home in Westfield, New Jersey, he carried out an unimaginable act, ending the lives of his entire family and vanishing without a trace. For nearly 18 years, his identity remained a mystery, until a national TV show helped uncover the chilling truth. John List was the product of a strict upbringing. Born in 1925, he was raised in a household where discipline and order were paramount. As an adult, he became a methodical and reserved man, working as an accountant. In the 1960s, he married Helen, a quiet and devout woman, and together they had 3 children: Patricia, 16, John Jr., 15, and Frederick, 13. On the surface, the family appeared to be the epitome of normalcy, but cracks began to form. Behind closed doors, John List's life was unraveling. He faced mounting financial pressures. His job was not as secure as he had hoped, and the family had fallen into significant debt. At the same time, his wife Helen's health was deteriorating, and the couple's relationship became strained. List's need for control became more apparent, and his obsessive-compulsive tendencies took over. He began to view his family as a burden, especially as his financial problems grew more desperate. On the morning of November 9th, 1971, John List took a series of actions that would seal the fate of his family. Over the course of several hours, he methodically shot his mother, Helen, and their 3 children. Afterward, he spent hours cleaning the crime scene, even preparing meals for the family's bodies to be found. His plan was chillingly cold and calculated. Once the murders were complete, John List disappeared without a trace, leaving behind no evidence of his whereabouts. For weeks, the police investigation turned up nothing. No one knew where John List had gone or why he had committed such a horrific act. His car was found abandoned in the town of Newark, and it seemed as though he had simply vanished. He left behind his wealth, his job, and his home, all to start a new life. The crime left the Westfield community in shock, and the mystery of his disappearance captivated the nation. John List's disappearance became one of the most talked about criminal cases of the 1970s and 1980s. The investigation into his family's murders went cold, but the case never left the public consciousness. In 1989, nearly 18 years after the murders, the FBI finally caught a break. The case was featured on the television program America's Most Wanted, and it was there that a new piece of evidence surfaced. A former neighbor recognized a police sketch of the suspected murderer and made the connection to John List, who had been living under a different identity in Virginia. The breakthrough came when List was arrested and charged with the murders of his wife, children, and mother. At the time of his arrest, he was living under the name Robert Peter Clark and had remarried. He had successfully evaded capture for nearly 2 decades, but the spotlight on him during America's Most Wanted was the catalyst for his eventual capture. The trial began in 1990, and the case became a media sensation. The prosecution painted John List as a cold, calculating murderer who had taken the lives of his entire family to escape his mounting problems. They argued that List had planned the murders for months, waiting for the right moment to act. The defense attempted to argue that List was mentally unstable and that he had acted in a moment of desperation. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. In 1990, John List was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each member of his family. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. The case was finally closed, but the damage to the List family's memory was irreparable. John List spent the rest of his life incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. During his time in prison, he remained relatively quiet, occasionally granting interviews to media outlets, but refusing to provide any real explanation for his actions. In 2008, John List died of natural causes in prison at the age of 82. His life, filled with secrets and violence, ended behind bars. The public fallout from the case was immense. The tragic loss of an entire family, followed by the long years of mystery, captured the nation's attention. John List became a symbol of the hidden darkness that can exist behind closed doors. The America's Most Wanted segment that led to his capture also highlighted the power of media in solving cold cases. For the List family's surviving relatives, the case remained a painful chapter, never fully healed. Reflecting on this case, one haunting question remains: how could someone who appeared so ordinary, so professional, be capable of such a horrific act? John List's story serves as a chilling reminder that even those closest to us can harbor deep, unfathomable secrets, and that appearances can be deceiving. What was it that drove John List to kill his entire family? Was it financial ruin, emotional instability, or something far darker? The answers may never be fully understood, but the legacy of his crime will continue to echo for years to come. Number 10. Mark hacking. It was supposed to be a new chapter in their lives, a young couple excited about the future. Mark Hacking and his wife, Lori, had been married just over a year when tragedy struck. On July 19, 2004, Laci disappeared, and what seemed like an ordinary missing person case soon spiraled into one of the most shocking and heartbreaking crimes in Utah's history. Behind the frantic search for Laci, a chilling secret lay hidden, one that would ultimately expose the dark truth about Mark Hacking. Mark and Laci Hacking were an inseparable couple, full of promise. Mark, a young man with aspirations to become a doctor, was studying at the University of Utah. Laci, bright and compassionate, was working towards her dream of becoming a nurse. They were a well-liked couple, known for their kindness and optimism. Friends and family often described them as a pair bound by love and ambition. But as it turned out, things weren't as perfect as they appeared. In July 2004, Mark reported his wife, Laci, missing. He told police that the night before, she had gone for a run, and when he woke up the next morning, she was gone. He claimed that she had vanished without a trace, leaving behind her car and belongings. The story seemed odd from the start. No one had seen Laci that morning, and there were no signs of a struggle or any evidence pointing to where she might have gone. The investigation quickly revealed strange inconsistencies in Mark's story. Mark told authorities that Laci was planning to leave for a trip to North Carolina to visit family, but investigators soon learned that she had never made any such plans. The more they dug into Mark's life, the more secrets began to surface. Laci's family and friends recalled her excitement for the future, her love for Mark, and her stable job. None of them believed she would have just disappeared without telling anyone. Then, in a shocking twist, Mark admitted to police that he had been lying about his wife's disappearance. He confessed that he had killed Laci, and what followed was a shocking revelation of deception and murder. Mark had not only killed Laci, but he had also spent months fabricating a story about his plans to become a doctor, a career path that had no basis in reality. He had been living a lie, and the woman he claimed to love had paid the ultimate price for it. In his confession, Mark explained that he had shot Laci in their apartment, then staged a scene to make it look like she had disappeared. He claimed that he panicked and disposed of her body in a dumpster. Mark later admitted that he had concocted the story about her going for a run and about the trip to North Carolina as a way to cover up his crime. He had planned to leave the country to avoid capture, but the investigation into Laci's disappearance quickly unraveled his plans. Mark Hacking was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial began in 2005, and Mark pleaded guilty to the charge of second-degree murder. Prosecutors argued that Mark had killed Laci after she discovered the truth about his deception, that he had been lying about his education and his future. The couple's plans for a future together were shattered, and Mark's inability to cope with the collapse of his lies led him to kill the woman who had stood by him through everything.